All right, so these notes are for the beginning of section 2 of chapter 8 in biology. So we're going to talk about the structure of DNA. Specifically, we're going to talk about the 4 nucleotides that make up DNA, and then a little bit about a little intro into the 3D structure of that DNA as well. So first thing we need to fill in, DNA is a polymer made up of monomers called nucleotides. So we actually had DNA in notes before, way back in like chapter 2 or something like that. And you also had this picture, but we're going to be a little bit more specific now, right? So I'm going to draw a simplified version of DNA here with a sugar phosphate backbone. That's why I keep alternating S and P. But each one of these sugars is also going to have a base attached to it. And so you can see a repeating subunit in here. Each one of these, right, repeating subunits is called a nucleotide, right? So we're just going to expand on that a little bit further. We're going to talk about how these bases, there are actually 4 different bases in DNA, A, T, G, and C. In this strand, there actually could be 4 of the same base, but they could all 4 be different, and it's essentially random, right? Not actually random because your DNA holds genes that encode information so that you can make proteins and you can exist. But a lot of your DNA actually is just a random sequence of nucleotides, right? So A, T, G, and C, that's what we're trying to get into. We got to be a little bit more specific now, right? So there are 4 bases: adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, right? Past that, I'm probably not going to say those words a whole lot, and you're never going to be expected to remember the full name for each one of the bases. You just have to know A, G, T, C, right? But there are other things you're also supposed to remember, other things you're supposed to know, because A and G could be grouped together, T and C can be grouped together. A and G are both 2-ring structures. So that base, that generic B that I had before, actually represents either this structure here that has 2 rings in it, and technically I made kind of a pentagon and a hexagon connected together because that's how those carbons and nitrogens would connect together, right? And I know there's nitrogen in there because these are bases, right? But at the end of the day, you don't need to know really specific details. You just need to know that there are 2 rings. If you had a picture that had 2 rings, it could be 2 circles for all I care, right? But A and G are called purines, Purines, right? T and C are structures that only have 1 ring. So I'm going to make 1 ring, 1 hexagon there, right? You could just draw a circle if you want. But T and C are called pyrimidines. So it's Pyrimidines, right? That INE ending means that they're a base, right? That they have nitrogens in there somewhere. But we don't really have to worry about that. You just need to know that A and G are 2 rings, T and C are 1 ring, right? And the ring matters because of our base pairing that we're going to talk about. So when we talk about the structure of DNA later, and we start talking about how it kind of looks like a ladder that's in a spiral, right? It's in that very specific double helix that we're going to talk about, right? It's important that there's actually the same number of rings in each rung to that ladder so that the ladder doesn't look funky, right? It can't be different sizes up and down. It should be a consistent size all the way through. So this is part of the evidence that was needed to figure out the structure of DNA and how it worked. So 1 ring versus 2 rings, that's actually important. You need to know that. Otherwise, the last thing we're going to do in here is Chargaff's data. This is what helped us figure out what our base pairs were, because when analyzed a DNA sample, always the amount of A is going to be equal to the amount of T in that sample. So of all the bases, there's the same amount of A as T, always, right? And there's always the same amount of G as there is C, right? So combining the ring structures and this data, we figured out what our base pairs were and how the structure would work overall. Now, what I need you to do in the notes today, right, we're going to do a specific kind of problem here because this actually illustrates what Chargaff was doing literally. So if you analyzed a sample of DNA, you could find out that, oh, like 12% of that DNA is A, right? 12% of those nucleotides contained adenine, right? And then you'd maybe ask, okay, what percent would be T, what percent would be G, what percent would be C? So this is a problem I'm going to have you guys do, and you might need to put this off to the side in your notes. You might need another piece of paper because we're actually going to do multiple examples here because I definitely would put this on a quiz or a test. So it's really simple. It's actually pretty easy, right? Since A and T are equal, you already know the answer to T. 12% of that sample would also be T. That's always going to be true. But finding out G and C is a separate problem, right? So the first thing I would think about is, okay, A and T combined would be 24%, right? Total for percents is always 100. So I can take 100 and I can subtract that 24, and that's going to give me what, like 76%? So, right, just got to be careful. You might want to jump right to G and say, oh, it's 76%. But there's also C, and G and C are equal to each other. So I can cut this 76 in half, divide it by 2, and that should give me the amount of G, the amount of C, because they'd be equal to each other. So half of 76 happens to be 38, right? So actually I know that G is 38%, and C is going to also be 38%. Again, not all problems are going to look exactly like this. In fact, usually I'm going to give you A or T or G or C. It doesn't really matter what it is. And then I'm going to ask you for 2 others. Now, the reason I do that is because that'll make sure that people are thinking about what they're doing, right? And maybe they won't. But if you don't understand that there's a C, you wouldn't understand that you need to divide by 2 over here. So you got to be careful and do your calculations correctly. Right? But if you've done a couple of these, it should be pretty easy. So just going to have a few examples here so that you can know what you're doing. Again, you can put this on a piece of scratch paper. So this example, we could start with maybe G, right? G is going to be like 22% of that DNA. And then maybe I'd ask you, okay, what percent would be T and what percent would be C, right? So again, all I need to do is think about my base pairs, right? G goes with C, so actually I know the C already is 22%. I just need to find out what T is, right? Same process as before. 22 and 22 is 44. So I gotta subtract 44 from 100. That should give me what, like 56, right? But then I have to recognize that, okay, 56 is not T. Half of that 56 is T because there's also A to deal with. So 56 divided by 2 should be 28. So I know that T is going to be 28%, right? So pretty easy, pretty simple. In this case, you don't have to tell me that A is 28% because I would know that, right? The question is, do you know that? And do you account for it when you're doing the problem? So it's going to look kind of like that. I'm going to do one more example here and then leave you with an example that you can finish for next class period so that I can see if you can figure it out, if you did figure it out. But I want to do an example here real quick that's just generic that actually illustrates the entire idea of this process and can help simplify things for you guys. So the whole reason I can do this is because there's only 4 parts and all those parts would add up to 100. And since A and T are equal to each other, I actually could sub in the same variable for those 2 things. And since G and C are equal to each other, I can do the same for them. So I'll use X's and Y's because that's what you're used to using in math, right? But simplifying this a little bit, that means 2x plus 2y equals 100. And that actually means that x plus y would be equal to 50, right? I just simplified, I divided everything by 2. Now that could be really useful for you as a shortcut because guess what 22 plus 28 is? Guess what 12 plus 38 is, right? You don't actually have to subtract from 100 and divide by 2 if you understand that those two things added up equal 50. So I'm going to leave you with this problem here. A is 31%. You figure out what G is, you figure out what T is, and I'll check it next class period for you.